Tonight, on the Forgotten Liturgy, we're not talking about the Louisiana legend, the mystical queen of New Orleans tourists love to imagine. No, this is a different woman, a woman whose power didn't come from spells or candles or whispered rituals, but from information, from observation, from understanding exactly how the system around her worked and how to make it destroy itself. Her name was Marie Laveau, the one you think you know, but the one history intentionally erased. Before this story goes deeper, take a moment to breathe and stay with me. Drop a comment with the city you're listening from, and subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy, so these buried histories never disappear again. In 1839, deep in Mississippi's Natchez district, the Bowmont Plantation rose like a monument to Southern pride. 3,000 acres of flat, impossibly rich soil, white columns gleaming against the sky. A household that liked to imagine itself civilized, refined, the picture of Southern virtue. But behind that, facade was the same machine that powered every plantation in the region. Enslaved people whose labor made the Bowmont name wealthy enough to pretend it was royalty. Charles Bowmont ruled over the land like a monarch, with his wife Eleanor policing the family's reputation while running the household with a velvet-covered iron fist. Their children were groomed for the world that awaited them: law, politics, marriage, inheritance. Beneath them moved the overseers, particularly Cyrus Holt, a man whose cruelty was precise, calculated, and always just short of damaging the property he was sworn to control. And beneath them, the enslaved, the cooks, the carpenters, the field workers whose hands built everything and changed nothing. This was the world Marie entered when she arrived chained in the back of a wagon, purchased for $850 at the second largest slave market in the South. Her bill of sale described her like an item. 23 years old, healthy, literate, skilled with herbs, valuable. But one detail should have been a warning: literate. Reading was a crime for people like Marie, and yet no one questioned how she'd learned, or why her previous owner had sold such a profitable, useful woman for less than she was worth. Beaumont's agent accepted the vague explanation he was given that the Louisiana owner needed money, that operations were downsizing. What no one knew was that the man who sold her had been terrified of her. Not because she had fought back, not because she'd disobeyed, but because strange things seemed to happen around Marie. Secrets surfaced. Punishments fell apart. Situations shifted just enough to save someone at the exact right moment. Little coincidences that happened too often to be chance. Arona couldn't prove anything. He couldn't even explain what frightened him. He just knew he wanted her gone. So Marie arrived at Bowmont Plantation, quiet, watchful, and far smarter than anyone realized. She was placed in the domestic cabins behind the main house-bare wooden structures where 4 to 6 women shared tight quarters. Her roommates were Dinah, the laundry matron who had spent her entire life on that land; Rachel, the shy kitchen worker with a child in the nursery cabin; and Lily, a seamstress close to Marie's age. Marie said almost nothing that first night. She unpacked slowly, intentionally, arranging her belongings with the kind of care that suggested ritual, not routine. A bundle of dried herbs, a box of needles, and a leather-bound journal, so soft with age it looked like cloth. That journal was her secret, her weapon, her map. And the Bowmont family had no idea. The most dangerous person on their plantation had just stepped quietly into their world. Marie's journal slipped from her fingers only for a second before she caught Dinah's eyes studying her. The older woman's question was soft, almost a confession in itself. "You can read." Literacy was contraband in Mississippi. A crime for a slave, a threat to the entire system. Marie held Dinah's gaze, measuring her, choosing the exact shape of her lie. "I remember things," she said gently. "Recipes, remedies, the patterns my grandmother taught me. Sometimes I make marks to help me recall, but I don't know if that's reading." It was an unanswer that suggested everything without admitting anything. Dinah gave a knowing nod. "Best to be careful with what you know and what you let others see. Holt don't like slaves who think too much." "I understand," Marie replied. And she did. She understood perfectly. The next morning, her real work began. She was taken to the kitchen house where Patience, the head cook and quiet power in the domestic hierarchy, assessed her with a professional's eye. Patience had the build of a woman who'd lifted iron pots for 3 decades, and a presence that demanded precision. "You know herbs?" she asked without ceremony. "Yes, ma'am. My grandmother was a healer. I know fever plants, pain plants, roots for sleep, leaves for wounds. Can you grow them? Not just use them?" Marie nodded. "If the soil is good, I can make anything grow." Patience seemed satisfied. "Martha died last year. Ain't been nobody to tend the herb bed since. That'll be your work. Garden in the mornings, healing in the afternoons, kitchen in the evenings, Sundays off, unless someone's dying." Demanding, yes, but it gave Marie what she needed. Access, movement, a reason to walk the plantation freely. A reason to listen. The herb garden behind the kitchen was a tired patch of earth half claimed by weeds, but beneath the neglect, Marie saw structure. Someone long ago had arranged the space with intention. She ran her hand through the soil. Dry, but salvageable. "I can work with this," she murmured, and already she was planning. In the weeks that followed, she transformed the garden with deliberate, meticulous care. Feverfew for aching heads, comfrey to knit wounds, chamomile for uneasy stomachs, willow bark for pain, valerian for restless nights. Plants were knowledge made physical, and Marie cultivated them strategically, just as she cultivated everything else. She watched the plantation with an herbalist's eye, mapping its strengths, its weaknesses, its diseases. She learned that Cyrus Holt kept ledgers of every bushel, every punishment, every expense numbers that revealed the skeleton of the entire operation. She learned that young Thomas Bowmont, home from his law studies, scattered important documents carelessly across the library table, assuming the slaves who cleaned after him were blind. She learned that the Beaumonts discussed business and debts freely during dinner, believing no one in the room could possibly understand what they said. She learned that Holt's 2 assistants despised each other, each hoping to undermine the other for favor cracks that could be widened. She learned which enslaved people were trusted, which were respected, which ones carried influence. Leadership existed in the quarters long before the Beaumonts imagined it did, and she learned that information, when traded like currency, was more powerful than any weapon. Marie began planting seeds, not just in the ground, but teen people. With Dinah, she relieved the woman's aching hands with herbal poultices. Dinah repaid her with quiet insights into the Beaumont household rhythms. Wheat Patien's Marie proved reliability, becoming a woman the cook depended on. Patience, in turn, spoke freely about upcoming events, family tensions, and changes in the plantation's routine. With the field hands, Marie became something close to a village doctor, and when people trust you with their pain, they tell you everything else too. By the end of her 3rd month, Marie had woven herself into the center of the plantation's unseen network. A quiet, soft-spoken woman who simply did her work and remembered everything. Only then, when her roots were deep in a web firmly spun, did she begin to test the edges of her methods. Marie's first quiet test of influence arrived in late April, when a field hand named Samuel was accused of stealing a ham from the smokehouse. Samuel was a strong, steady man in his 30s, known for working hard and keeping to himself. His wife Grace and their 2 small children depended on him, which made the accusation feel even more crushing. According to Briggs Holt's newly hired assistant, eager to impress Samuel, had been seen walking near the smokehouse at dusk. The next morning, a ham was missing. Later, a search of the quarters produced that same ham wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath loose boards behind Samuel's cabin. On a plantation where accusations traveled faster than truth, this was enough. Theft meant 20 lashes delivered publicly, sometimes more if the master wished to reinforce his authority. Samuel insisted he was innocent. His desperation was clear. He repeated again and again that he had never touched a ham, never been near the smokehouse at that hour, and had no idea how the meat reached his home. But his words held no weight beside the testimony of an overseer's assistant. By the time he was locked in the plantation jail and airless brick cell near Holt's quarters, the punishment was already being discussed with grim certainty. The whipping would take place at the end of the week, before the entire enslaved community. That night, Grace arrived at Marie's cabin with tears streaking her face, begging for help. She spoke quickly, breathlessly, saying Samuel wouldn't steal, not with the children to worry about, not with everything he could lose. Marie questioned her gently, listening closely. Briggs was the only one who claimed to have seen Samuel near the smokehouse, and no one else had confirmed it. The ham found behind the cabin could have been placed there by anyone. None of the cabins had locks, and as Grace talked, Marie's mind began arranging the pieces quietly, carefully. The next day, Marie began gathering information the same way she tended her herbs, methodically, patiently, without drawing attention. She spoke to those who worked near the smokehouse, asking harmless-sounding questions about who passed through that evening. She visited people who lived near Samuel's cabin, gently probing to see whether anyone unfamiliar had been seen nearby. She observed Briggs himself, his posture, his interactions, the tiny anxieties that flickered across his face when Holt questioned him. Then she found something unexpected. The week before the theft, Briggs had hosted a visitor, a young man in his early 20s, who stayed 2 nights and left at dawn before most people woke. No one knew who he was, though several enslaved workers had seen him. The direction he traveled pointed toward Natchez. Marie discovered something else as well. Briggs had been sloppy with the plantation records, not disastrously, but small discrepancies, code and weights, that didn't fully match the picker's reports. Tool counts slightly off. Numbers that betrayed either incompetence or deliberate adjustments. Holt, still trusting his new assistant, hadn't noticed. And then Marie heard a name. James Holt, Cyrus Holt's nephew. A young man who'd been trying unsuccessfully to establish himself as an overseer. A young man known for ambition without restraint, the kind who would do anything to prove himself. And suddenly Marie felt the pieces fall into alignment. What if the visitor had been James Z's? What if he had taken the ham when he left, either as a casual gift or because it was easier than asking permission? What if Briggs, terrified of appearing incompetent so early in his employment, chose to hide the missing ham by framing someone else? Samuel might simply have been the closest man walking by at the wrong moment. Marie couldn't accuse anyone, not directly. She had no authority, but influence did not always require authority. Sometimes it required only precision. The next morning, while helping patients in the kitchen, Marie spoke as though the thought had just come to her. She mentioned collecting herbs near Holt's quarters the previous week and seen a young man slipping away early at dawn with something wrapped in cloth. Patients barely reacted at first, until Marie added quietly that the visitor reminded her of Holt's same build, same way of walking. That detail made Patience pause. A seed planted. That evening, Patience repeated the observation to Danina, who cleaned the overseer's quarters. Danina casually confirmed a young man had stayed there for 2 nights, and because house servants traded information the way the wind passed through the trees, the detail traveled. Eventually it reached Eleanor Bowmont, the sharp-minded mistress of the house who managed the accounts and had a gift for noticing inconsistencies. Eleanor mentioned it to her husband, Charles Bowmont, who frowned at learning Holt had kept the visit quiet. He confronted Holt the next morning, casually but pointedly. Holt faltered, admitting that yes, his nephew James had stopped by briefly, but he hadn't thought it important. Bowmont accepted the explanation, but the doubt lingered in his mind. Meanwhile, Marie had been working another angle. While treating Porter, the aging white accountant whose joints pained him, she gently suggested she might have misunderstood some numbers in the Cotton House ledger. She said she'd heard workers mention gathering 42 bushels when the written record listed 40. She apologized for likely being confused. Porter, who prided himself on exactness and had little patience for sloppiness, felt a flicker of irritation not at Marie, but at whoever had entered the numbers. Sloppy numbers meant sloppy management, and sloppy management reflected badly on the overseer. The seeds were now scattered across the plantation as hierarchy, from the kitchen to the quarters to the master, as household to the bookkeeper's desk. All Marie needed to do was wait for them to sprout. Porter's curiosity had already been stirred, but once he checked the Cotton House records more carefully, his suspicions sharpened. The numbers didn't scream fraud. but they whispered careless small inconsistencies, scattered like crumbs leading back to Briggs. When Porter reported these errors to Charles Bowmont, the planter immediately confronted Holt, who found himself forced to admit that Briggs, new and overeager, might not fully understand the plantation's accounting system. Holt tried to soften the embarrassment, calling them learning mistakes, but the damage was done. Another quiet crack appeared in Briggs's reputation. Marie knew the moment was right to plant the final piece of information. Her method was the same as always: soft, indirect, wrapped in innocence. She mentioned to Danina that she'd overheard someone wondering whether the smokehouse inventory was accurate. Danina repeated the comment to Eleanor Bowmont while folding linens, and Eleanor, who never ignored domestic oddities, passed it to her husband that evening. The next day, Charles Bowmont ordered a full inspection of the smokehouse. What they found altered everything. 3 hams were missing, not one, and the ham planted behind Samuel S. cabin had been cut, with a blade finer than the rough kitchen knives distributed to the enslaved workers. A gentleman's knife, a visitor's knife. Suddenly, the tidy accusation against Samuel looked messy, uncertain. If multiple hams were missing, and one bore markings from a tool Samuel did not possess, then another possibility emerged, one that pointed toward Holt's unexplained visitor. The nephew who had left before dawn, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. The speculation was quiet, but powerful. Quiet enough to avoid confrontation. Powerful enough to change the outcome. Bowmont, unwilling to punish a man without confidence in the evidence, ordered Samuel released. The official explanation was simple. The case lacked certainty. Samuel returned to his family, shaken but whole. Briggs received a stern reprimand and a warning to be more exact in both numbers and accusations. Holt received instructions to report all future visitors without exception, and Marie, with her hands calmly in the soil, tending her herbs, appeared entirely uninvolved. But the enslaved community knew. They learned not through gossip, but through the subtle currents that passed between cabins at dusk, through shared looks, through unspoken understanding. In tear eyes, Marie became someone different. Someone who saw patterns others overlooked. Someone who could change the course of events without raising her voice or breaking a rule. A woman whose intelligence could shift power just slightly, but enough to matter. They began to come to her not only for fevers, coughs, and aching joints, but for fear, confusion, and hope. Her second great test arrived in June. Clara, a skilled seamstress in her late 20s, came to Marie. Her needlework clothed the plantation slaves and Bowmont family alike. Her daughter, just 8 years old, worked in the main house as a helper in the kitchen. The bond between them was the center of Clara's life, and now it was threatened. Charles Bowmont had fallen into debt after a failed speculation. He'd gambled on cotton prices rising, only to watch them plummet. One of his creditors, a plantation owner named Garrett from Louisiana, offered to forgive a portion of the debt in exchange for several slaves, including Clara. Garrett was notorious. His plantation was a place whispered about in grief-filled tones where workers died from exhaustion, where cruelty was casual and constant. To be sold, there was to lose not just freedom, but life. Clara sobbed as she told Marie that Garrett wanted her, not her daughter. They would be separated forever. Marie listened without interrupting. This was no small matter. Samuel's case had involved an overseer's error, but Clara's fate was tied directly to Bowmont's financial survival. Marie needed more than influence this time. She needed leverage. She asked Clara everything about the debt. Then she spent days gathering pieces of the puzzle. Bowmont owed Garrett about $3,000. The sale was scheduled before month's end. Garrett was deeply disliked among several families for ruthless business dealings. And, most importantly, Thomas. Bowmont, the son-in-law, had been hired to represent a planter named Whitfield in a land dispute against Garrett himself. That single detail changed everything. If Charles Bowmont sold enslaved workers to a man, his son was actively fighting in court. It could compromise Thomas's reputation, stain his career before it even began. But Thomas had no idea the sale was happening. Marie changed that. The information traveled the way she designed it. To Clara, whispered it to Danina, who passed it to the butler, who mentioned it while serving Thomas during one of his visits home. Thomas reacted immediately. Conflict of interest, personal embarrassment, professional risk. He confronted his father, urging him to reconsider. But Charles insisted he had no alternative. He needed to settle the debt. Marie decided to create an alternative. She began gathering information. She was never supposed to access financial documents. Whispered conversations, scraps of correspondence. She read papers Thomas left scattered in the library. She listened as house slaves repeated what they heard during evening gatherings. She asked subtle questions of workers from neighboring plantations, and she found hope. A planter named Prescott, 20 miles away, had recently gained significant funds from selling land. He disliked Garrett and enjoyed undercutting him whenever possible. He was searching for investments. Marie couldn't speak to him directly. No white man would entertain business ideas from an enslaved woman, but she could place information where it would eventually reach him. She spoke casually to Peter, a slave who worked for a merchant family in Natchez. She mentioned she'd heard the Bowmont was seeking alternative financing, and then she let the whisper begin its journey. Peter's quiet remark to his owners drifted through town like a seed carried on wind, passing from one merchant to another until it reached the ears of the wealthy and calculating Prescott. He already disliked Garrett, and the idea that Garrett might profit from someone else's suffering irritated him more than he cared to admit. So Prescott made his move. He approached Bowmont with a deal wrapped in generosity, but sharpened with hidden purpose. He offered to clear Beaumont's debt to Garrett through a favorable loan on the condition that Bowmont use his cotton broker and offer him a share of the next harvest. Bowmont accepted gratefully, unaware of the rivalry he was stepping into. The sale was undone. Clara stayed with her daughter. She never learned the full truth, that Marie had quietly moved mountains for her. All she knew was that the worst had been avoided, and somehow, miraculously, she and her child were safe. But the others in the quarters began to understand. Marie's influence was not luck, not coincidence. She saw the hidden machinery of plantation life, its levers, tensions, and weak joints, and she learned exactly where to press. By the fall of 1840, she had become a silent pillar for the enslaved community. People came not only for herbs or healing, but for impossible problems, threats of forced sale, false accusations, forbidden love. Marie listened patiently, asking questions that seemed aimless but were, in truth, precise tools. Who witnessed what? What had happened earlier that day? What habits had people noticed? What conversations drifted through the big house? And then she worked. Never directly, never loudly. Her method was as delicate as the way she planted seeds in her garden, choosing the soil, waiting for the right moment, letting roots form unseen. She gathered information, found the leverage point, planted carefully crafted truth through someone who wouldn't recognize its purpose, waited for it to grow, and always stayed invisible. Her interventions were subtle but devastatingly effective. When Joseph was accused of laziness, Marie discovered that Briggsy, eager to prove his worth after the Samuel incident, had been altering cotton weights. She mentioned the confusing numbers to the bookkeeper while treating his aching joints. Bowmont soon discovered the fraud. Briggs was fired. Joseph's name was cleared. When Ruth was targeted by a visiting relative of the Bowmont family, Marie learned of his gambling debts and delivered that knowledge through a delicate chain of gossip too. The man, his wife. The scandal erupted in the big house, and the man slunk away in disgrace. Ruth was left in peace. When Daniel and Esther wished to marry but feared the overseer would spitefully separate them, Maria uncovered the overseer's secret theft of supplies sold in Natchez. Evidence reached Beaumont's desk, as if by accident. The overseer was dismissed. His replacement had no interest in interfering with a simple marriage. Each victory was small, subtle, nearly invisible. But within the quarters, a quiet revolution began. People started to believe that the world could be nudged, that intelligence could be a shield, that information, in the right hands, was a weapon. Marie became a legend without anyone daring to say her name too loudly. But influence, even when whispered, draws eyes. Cyrus Hall had spent 15 years studying the patterns of enslaved people where trouble brewed, where rebellion yet Marie didn't fit any of his categories. She kept no secrets, held no meetings, carried no hidden blades. She tended her garden, walked with calm purpose. And still, things happened around her. Accusations collapsed. Punishments dissolved. His authority was undermined in ways too subtle to trace. She was always nearby but never involved. Hall didn't need proof to feel danger. Suspicion was enough. By the summer of 1840, he had begun watching her, asking questions, testing boundaries, looking for even the smallest misstep. But Marie had been expecting this. She shrank herself deliberately, asked innocent questions, played the part of a woman ruled by plants and folk tales rather than strategy. It wasn't enough to erase his suspicion. Hall was too seasoned for that, but it forced him into uncertainty. Watch it. She pretended not to notice, and between them, an invisible tension stretched tighter each day. Both knew a time was coming when it would snap. The confrontation Marie had been sensing for months finally arrived in September of 1840. It began quietly, like most dangers did on Bowmont Plantation, when Thomas Bowmont, the newly married son of the lawyer, focused his attention on someone who had no way to defend herself. Thomas had married Catherine Hartwell that spring, joining the Bowmonts to one of the most powerful families in Vicksburg. The Hartwells brought money, connections, and political protection. Exactly what the Bowmonts needed. The marriage had been arranged with the precision of a business transaction, and both families expected Thomas to uphold the image of a respectable young gentleman. But by late summer, Thomas's polished facade had begun to crack. He visited the plantation often, claiming legal duties, but in truth he used those visits to escape the scrutiny of his wife's family. And during those long hours, wandering the main house, he noticed Ruth, 16 years old, quiet, hard-working, trying desperately to stay invisible in a world where the wrong glance could destroy her life. Thomas's growing interest quickly became obvious to her mother, Hannah. He lingered near the kitchen, found excuses to ask Ruth questions, brushed her arm, commented on her appearance. Hannah recognized the signs with a terror born from experience. If Thomas decided he wanted Ruth, nothing and no one could stop him. Any protest, any resistance, could mean punishment or cell. One night, trembling, Hannah came to Marie. "He's going to take her," she whispered. "Please, there has to be something you can do." Marie stayed silent a long time. The risk was enormous. This wasn't an overseer or a visiting cousin. This was Thomas Bowmont, well-connected, ambitious, and protected by both his family and his in-laws. Any move against him could destroy her, but allowing Ruth to be harmed was unthinkable. She finally said, "Tell me everything you know about him." Over the next week, house servants quietly fed Marie a complete portrait of Thomas Bowmont's life. He was 26, ambitious, determined to carve a path into Mississippi politics. His marriage to Catherine was essential. Her family's wealth and influence were the foundation of his future. But Thomas lived beyond his means. He carried gambling debts, bad investments, and relied heavily on both families' financial support. His reputation was everything. One whisper of scandal could shatter his political aspirations. The most important figure in that delicate balance was Catherine's mother. Mrs. Hartwell, a strict, sharp-sighted woman, already wary of Thomas's motives. For marrying her daughter, she watched him closely, and Thomas knew it. Marie found her leverage. She couldn't accuse Thomas. She couldn't speak directly to Catherine. She couldn't even guarantee Ruth would always have someone beside her. But she could make Thomas believe that his behavior, his private behavior, was beginning to reach the wrong ears. Her first step was simple: keep Ruth surrounded. Marie reorganized the kitchen schedule so Ruth was always working with others, learning with the older cooks, never isolated where Thomas might corner her. It looked harmless, efficient, even helpful. The house staff accepted the change, but Marie knew it wouldn't stop him forever. Men like Thomas carved out opportunities when denied them, so she built a larger plan, one that reached far beyond Bowmont. Mrs. Hartwell, if she received even a trace of concern about Thomas's behavior, not accusations, not scandals but quiet, Refined any zit would be enough to put Thomas on guard. The trick was getting that concern to her naturally. Marie discovered that Mrs. Hartwell would be visiting Natchez in October, staying with the Chambers family friends of hers, just 10 miles from Bowmont. That was the path. Information traveled along the networks of planter families like rivers beneath the surface. If Marie could place a hint of worry far upstream, it would drift to the Hartwell family on its own. To begin, she sought out Peter, an enslaved man on the Chambers plantations. Someone trusted, someone who carried news the way others carried water. Marie approached him slowly, carefully, knowing that every step forward tightened the danger around her. And this time the danger was closer than ever before. Marie's plan began with something deceptively simple. Medicine. She sent herbs and remedies to the Chambers plantation, establishing herself as a healer whose knowledge traveled farther than her body was allowed to go. Peter, who worked there and suffered from chronic headaches, became dependent on her fever tea. In return, he shared exactly what she needed. The rhythms of the Chambers household, the guests expected in October, the whispers that drifted through sitting rooms where plantation wives discussed reputations as carefully as they arranged their silver. Through Peter, Marie learned that Mrs. Hartwell would be visiting the Chambers family soon, attending luncheons and card gatherings where quiet gossip moved like smoke. That was where the seed needed to be planted. She began with offhand conversations, never naming Thomas, never pointing a finger, just small, seemingly harmless remarks about how some planter sons behaved recklessly with the women they owned, how such behavior would devastate a marriage if it ever reached the wrong ears. Peter understood the meaning beneath her words. He shared those same general worries with other slaves in the Chambers household, who eventually passed them, carefully and indirectly, to their mistress. How slaves had a talent for raising concern without raising suspicion. By the time Mrs. Hartwell arrived, Mrs. Chambers was already thinking about improprieties whispered elsewhere. Over tea, she mentioned, quite gently, that she hoped Thomas was treating Catherine with the respect she deserved. She added that she'd heard certain young men in the area were not always as honorable as their polished manners suggested. Mrs. Hartwell, already protective, already cautious, immediately pressed for details. Mrs. Chambers had none, only vague murmurs. But uncertainty was often more powerful than proof. She advised that a mother's eyes might be worth keeping open. With that single conversation, the seed Marie planted began to root. But one seed was not enough. Marie wove a second. Thread news from Natchez. Slaves who worked near the gambling houses told her that Thomas had been seen there repeatedly, losing money he didn't have. Marie nudged that information into the merchant slave network. It drifted naturally, from one plantation's servant to another, until it reached the Chambers household, and from there to Mrs. Hartwell. Now alarmed, she wrote to her husband. William Hartwell, a banker who had invested heavily in Thomas's reputation, demanded a private meeting with his son-in-law. That conversation shook Thomas more than any accusation could. Combined with his mother-in-law's sudden scrutiny, he found himself cornered not by force, but by fear of disgrace. Then Marie delivered the final, quiet blow. One afternoon, as Thomas crossed through the kitchen, he overheard Hannah speaking anxiously to Patience. She was saying she feared a Bowmont man had taken an interest in Ruth, her voice trembling, her words painfully clear. They were not shouting. They were simply speaking as worried women do, but it was loud enough for a guilty man to hear. Thomas froze. If the enslaved were talking about it, then the household could talk about it. If the household talked about it, then the Chambers family could talk about it. And if they talked about it, his mother-in-law would hear every word. Within days, Thomas returned. He avoided the kitchen entirely. His attention shifted to his law books and political ambitions, his behavior suddenly immaculate. Ruth never understood why the danger vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She only knew she was safe again. But someone else noticed. Cyrus Holt had been watching Marie for months. Things happened around her, small shifts in fortune, accusations dissolving, punishments avoided. There were no weapons, no secret meetings, no open defiance. Yet the enslaved were becoming confident, hopeful, connected in ways Holt found dangerous. And now, somehow, Thomas Beaumont's sudden change of behavior traced back, however faintly, to Marie's presence. He couldn't prove anything, but he didn't need proof. By November, Holt made his move. He accused her of witchcraft. It was a charge rooted in both fear and convenience. Holt believed that Marie's influence could only be supernatural. No enslaved woman he thought could be so clever, so precise, so quietly powerful. And witchcraft was a crime that needed no evidence, only suspicion. Chattas Bowmont, bound by law to investigate, summoned Marie to the library on a cold morning. She stood before him and Holt, surrounded by shelves of books meant to symbolize the kind of knowledge people like her were forbidden to possess. Beaumont's expression was unreadable as he spoke. These are serious accusations. Mr. Holt claims you use unnatural means to influence events on this plantation. He says nothing around you happens by chance. What do you say to these charges? Marie kept her gaze lowered, her voice. Come, she had rehearsed this moment in her mind for months. Sir, she said softly, I am an herb woman. I grow plants. I make remedies. Nothing more. And as the room held its breath, Marie understood that the next words she spoke might determine whether she lived or vanished. Marie spoke quietly, deliberately, every word measured. I know which herbs is fever, which soothe pain, which can be made into poultices for wounds. My grandmother taught me when I was young, and I've practiced it all my life. But I know nothing of witchcraft or the unnatural. I only do the work I was given. Holt's eyes narrowed. People say you do more than give remedies. They say things change after speaking with you, that you know things you shouldn't, that you influence events beyond your reach. They talk to me, sir, Marie admitted. They speak about troubles the way people do when they are sick or hurting. When the body suffers, the mind does too. Sometimes they need to talk as much as they need medicine. Listening is part of healing. My grandmother taught me that as well. And advice? Beaumont asked. Sometimes, sir, if they ask, only simple advice, the kind anyone might give. If someone is worried about being accused, I might suggest they explain their side to the overseer. If someone has a family concern, I might suggest speaking to you or Mrs. Bowmont. I have no power to change things myself. I am just a slave who tends plants and listens. Holt fumed. She's lying. Manipulating. Too clever for a slave. She influences what she shouldn't. Cleverness is not witchcraft, Beaumont said calmly. Intelligence is not supernatural. Slaves can be intelligent. Marie is skilled at her work, but that does not make her unnatural. He turned to Marie. Do you read and write? Marie's answer was careful. Some, sir. My previous owner in Louisiana allowed it to read receipts and record remedies. I have not taught anyone. I use it only to keep track of plants and remedies, to make marks to help me remember. Beaumont opened a drawer and pulled out her leather journal. Marie's heart sank. This yours? Yes, sir. Recipes. Plant notesings my grandmother taught me. He flipped the pages, seeing the coded observations she'd written about plantation life, patterns of people, and subtle networks of influence. To him, it might have been nothing more than herbal notes, but anyone looking closer could see the sophistication beneath. Finally, he closed it. I find no evidence of witchcraft. She is literate, intelligent, skilled at her work. As long as she performs her duties and causes no direct trouble, there is no cause for punishment. Mr. Holt, your concerns are noted, but I act only on proof. Marie understood the implicit warning. Her cleverness was tolerated, but only within boundaries. You may return to your work, Beaumont said, but you are being watched. Any direct challenge to our interests will not be forgiven. Yes, sir, Marie replied quietly. After that confrontation, Marie adapted. She became more selective, intervening only where outcomes could help the enslaved population without threatening the Bowmont family directly. She began teaching others her methods. Danina learned to gather intelligence from the main house. Hannah learned to anticipate patterns in the family's behavior, and Peter at the Chambers plantation became part of a broader network. Marie was building a system that could survive even if she were sold, punished, or killed. She was teaching that intelligence and subtlety could be weapons as potent as rebellion, and then her thoughts turned further toward freedom, not escape, which was dangerous and often futile, but legal freedom achieved through the very structures that enslaved people were denied. Marie learned about processes for manumission, the rare opportunities for purchasing freedom, and the networks of free black communities in New Orleans and elsewhere. Through her careful observation of legal documents, conversations with connected slaves, and the intelligence network she had cultivated, she began to envision a future not only for herself but for others. Her quiet revolution was only beginning. By 1841, Marie discovered that Charles Bowmont's finances were in serious trouble. The cotton market had been unstable for years, prices swinging wildly due to weather, international trade, and speculative brokers. Bowmont had invested expecting high returns, but the market had fallen, leaving him deep in debt. Marie learned of this through her network, overheard conversations between Charles and Ella Lenner, glimpsed letters in the library, and even Thomas discussing his father's financial woes with Catherine. The threat was real. Selling enslaved people to cover debts could tear families apart, sending people to harsher plantations. Marie meticulously mapped Bowmont's finances, creditors, debts, deadlines, assets, land, partnerships, market trends, reliable brokers, and risky ones. Her goal was to find leverage to solve Bowmont's crises without anyone being sold. She discovered that one creditor, Sutton, a Natchez banker, was involved in fraudulent land sales rumors of which had begun circulating among business circles. Sutton's desperation to protect his reputation made him vulnerable. Marie couldn't act directly. She had no business standing. Instead, she ensured the information reached Prescott, Sutton's rival banker, through her network. She fed the rumor to Peter at the Chambers Plantation, who passed it to a merchant household in Natchez, which eventually reached a free black man connected to Prescott. Prescott investigated, verified the fraud, and saw an opportunity to both expand his business and undermine Sutton. He approached Bowmont and other clients, offering favorable loans in exchange for future banking business and a share in the next cotton harvest. Bowmont, seeing a path to solvency without selling slaves, accepted. The crisis was averted. Families remained intact, and the enslaved community remained unaware of Marie's orchestration. What appeared as fortune and business competition had been quietly engineered by her. From 1841 to 1844, Marie's influence grew. She intervened in punishments, prevented sales, mitigated disputes, and her reputation spread across plantations. But she now pursued a greater goal: facilitating legal freedom. She studied mechanisms for emancipation, manumission by owners, self-purchase where allowed, purchase by free people of color, and rare legal challenges exploiting technicalities in ownership. She identified candidates, people whose skills, connections, or circumstances made freedom feasible and created opportunities. For Daniel, a skilled carpenter, she connected him to prominent families in Natchez through intermediaries, ensuring his talents were noticed. Bowmont hired him out, allowing him to retain a small percentage of earnings. Over years, Daniel accumulated enough to purchase his freedom, which Bowmont approved in 1843, seeing more value in a free craftsman than in maintaining him as a slave. Similarly, for Esther, who had saved money from her garden, Marie guided her through the legal process of manumission, using a networked free black woman in Natchez to connect Esther to sympathetic lawyers. Marie's strategy was subtle, strategic, and relentless freedom became a possibility, one carefully planted seed at a time. By 1845, Esther had saved nearly $200, but she didn't know how to approach Bowmont or navigate the legal process to purchase her freedom. Marie arranged for her to meet Gila, a free black woman in Natchez, who guided Esther through the manumission process and connected her with a lawyer to prepare a proposal. Carefully structured, Esther's offer included her $200 savings, plus a promise to supply vegetables to the plantation for 5 more years, totaling around $400, reasonable for a woman of her skills and age. Bowmont, now financially stable, accepted. Esther became a free woman, yet remained connected to the enslaved community she had left behind. Each case took months or years, but gradually, legal freedom became attainable for others, orchestrated silently by Marie. By 1844, Marie herself had saved nearly $300 from selling herbs and remedies to white families. Yet she hesitated. Leaving Bowmont meant abandoning the network she had built, the people she protected. Freedom or influence, the choice weighed heavily. In spring 1845, the decision was forced upon her. Cyrus Hall, long suspicious of Marie, finally found what he believed was evidence. Benjamin, a trusted intermediary who carried messages between plantations, was stopped by a patrol. Hidden in his belongings was a coded letter detailing slave sales and finances information no enslaved person should have. Under questioning, Benjamin revealed he had gathered this information at Marie's request. Hall brought the evidence to Bowmont, arguing Marie was directing an intelligence network among the enslaved, potentially to incite rebellion or escape. This time, the evidence was undeniable. Marie was arrested and held in the plantation jail. The enslaved community trembled. Their strategist, protector, and hope was confined. But Marie had planned for this. She had trained others in her methods of observation, information gathering, and planting influence. From her cell, she sent a message through the network to Thomas Bowmont in Vic. It contained critical intelligence about a stalled legal case missing documentation for a property dispute. The message explained where the documents were hidden and how to obtain them legally alongside a proposal. If Thomas acted on her behalf, she would be spared harsh punishment. If he ignored it, the case would remain stalled, risking his reputation. Thomas, ambitious and pragmatic, saw the value. Marie was too clever and dangerous to remain in Mississippi, yet her skills could be used to resolve her situation. He convinced his father that selling Marie to a contact in New Orleans, a free black woman named Helen, was financially and strategically sound. Helen needed someone with Marie's intelligence and skills. Bowmont agreed. In June 1845, Marie was sold for $1,000 a price, reflecting her unique value. She arrived in New Orleans, leaving behind the network she had built and the community she had protected. But she left more than that. A method, a strategy, a way of thinking that continued to empower others. The network, though less effective, persisted. Still gathering information, still planting seeds of subtle influence, still resisting in invisible ways. New Orleans offered a transformed life, larger, diverse, with a significant, free black population who held businesses, operated communities, and wielded forms of power unknown in Mississippi. Helen's boarding house became Marie's new base, a place where her intelligence and skills could eventually secure her own freedom while continuing to influence the lives of those she sought to protect. Marie's new life in New Orleans began under clear terms. Helen had purchased her for $1,000, and Marie's work at the boarding house came with a salary, giving her a path to buy her own freedom. She threw herself into her responsibilities with the same systematic precision she had applied in Mississippi, managing the household, tending to sick boarders, cultivating an herb garden, and gradually building new networks in the city. New Orleans, with its mix of free people of color and enslaved populations, provided constant opportunities to continue her work. Marie connected with lawyers who specialized in manumission, free black sponsors, former slaves who assisted others, and activists who worked to expand legal rights. She began documenting her methods in a new journal, more detailed, systematic, and analytical than the one confiscated by Bowmont. She wrote about observing power structures, identifying leverage points, gathering information invisibly, planting influence, and creating change without leaving a trace. She analyzed cases, studied the psychology of authority, and outlined the principles of patience, trust, and network building. The journal became a manual for resistance, a blueprint for turning intelligence and information into weapons against oppression. Within 2 years, Marie earned enough to purchase her freedom. In 1847, at the age of 31, she became a free woman, yet she did not stop. Expanding her work, she leveraged her Mississippi network and New Orleans connections to help others navigate the legal processes of manumission. She trained trusted individuals in her methods, passing along fragments of her journal. These techniques spread quietly, evolving into a toolkit of subtle resistance, applied across the South by people whose names would never appear in history books. Marie lived the rest of her life in New Orleans, a healer, herbalist, strategist, and organizer. By her death in 1881 at 65, she had helped more than 200 people achieve legal freedom and had trained dozens in her methods of strategic resistance. But history largely erased her story. A contemporary free woman of color with the same name, a voodoo practitioner, became the dominant narrative. overshadowing the real Marie, the enslaved woman who wielded intelligence, observation, and strategic influence as tools of liberation. Her story was dangerous to the narratives America preferred: the passive slave waiting for salvation, or the violent rebel challenging the system openly. Marie's resistance was quiet, calculated, and devastatingly effective. She proved that intelligence, patience, and strategy could dismantle oppression from within. The fragments of her journal, scattered and testified to the real methods she used: careful observation, planting information, cultivating networks, and subtle influence. Marie Lavo's legacy was not supernatural. It was real, tangible, and threatening to the established order. She demonstrated that the enslaved were not passive victims but agents of history, shaping outcomes in ways white society could not anticipate. History refused to teach her story, not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true. Her life revealed that the most powerful resistance often leaves no trace, works within systems to dismantle them quietly, and uses them as tools to unlock the house from the inside, brick by brick. Her story is a reminder: knowledge is a weapon, strategy is power, and patience can achieve what violence cannot. Marie Lavo, the herb woman of Mississippi, who transformed lives through observation and influence, remains one of the most dangerous and revolutionary figures history tried to forget.